Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see everyone again. And we're going to go straight to our weekly Torah portion, which is the portion of Re'eh, which is found on page 998, if you happen to be following in the blue art scroll Chumash. So the name of the Torah portion is Re'eh. The word Re'eh means see. And Moshe Rabbeinu begins by saying, see that I have for you today a blessing and a curse. And what Moshe Rabbeinu is telling the Jewish people is one of the most important and fundamental principles of Judaism. Everyone knows that Maimonides, the great Rambam, codified he summarized all of Judaism into 13 principles. And one of the 13 principles that Maimonides codified is that God gives every person free will. What makes us unique as human beings, and when I say unique, I mean literally the only created being that God made, is that we exclusively have free will. So those forms of life that are beneath us, like animals or plants or inanimate objects, obviously have no free will. Now, does an animal have a choice whether it could eat now or not eat now? Yeah, most probably it has that choice. But when we say free will, we mean free will based on wisdom, based on understanding, meaning moral, ethical, spiritual, righteous choices versus choices that are immoral. An animal doesn't choose to do what it does based on if it's right or wrong. An animal chooses to do what it does based on its instincts, its animalistic drives. And that's why animals are not held accountable for their actions. Only man is held accountable for their actions. As a matter of fact, starting on this Shabbat, we begin the month of Elul.
Hi, Harriet.
We know that on the we know that somebody's unmuted. Sorry. We know that on the Jewish calendar, starting Rosh Chodesh Elul, we spend 40 days from the first day of Elul all the way through Yom Kippur, focused on one thing and one thing only, and that is rectifying our behaviors that need improvement and resolving to do better. You know the story, I told it recently, that Henry Kissinger was renowned to be a perfectionist. And one time he asked one of his aides to write a speech for him, and the aide sent it in to Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger sent back a message and said, is this the best you can do? So he worked it over and proved it, sent it back to Henry Kissinger, got the same response. Is this the best you can do? After about the fourth or fifth time, the aide came into Henry Kissinger's office and said, Mr. Kissinger, I've reviewed this speech 5 times already. I've, contemplated every word in the speech, and this is the best I can do. And Henry Kissinger said, well, in that case, I'll read it now. So on the high holiday season, which begins on Rosh Chodesh Elul, and on Sunday morning, we start blowing the shofar, which is the wake-up call to start changing our ways, returning to God. The word teshuvah literally means return, not repentance. Return back to our relationship with God as it was before we severed it, or God forbid, or ruptured it in some way. So why do we do this every year, year in, year out? Because we're saying to ourselves, is this the best you can do? Is this the best you can do? And I always like to say that the biggest room in the world is the room for improvement. So most likely for the rest of our lives, we can always ask the same question, is this the best we can do? And in the word, throughout the holidays, especially in Yom Kippur, we talk about our sins, and we even pound our chest, al chet, for the sin of this, for the sin of that. And the word chet is translated as sin. And as you can tell already, a lot of Hebrew words aren't accurately translated. So Everyone says teshuva means repentance, but repentance means you're changing and becoming something new. Returning means you're going back to your former self, who you were before you sinned, because every person was pure and holy and righteous. But the word chet literally can mean missing the mark. So if I shoot a dart and I miss the mark, I haven't sinned, but I didn't hit the mark. Every one of us has to ask ourselves, not only what did we do wrong, but what did we do right that could have been done even better? And chet means to not fully fulfill our potential. And that in itself is a sin. As you know, that Reb Zusha on his deathbed was weeping, and his student said, "Why are you weeping?" He said, "Because I'm going to meet my creator soon, and I'm afraid of the day of judgment." And his student said, "Well, what are you afraid of? I mean, you are a good man." And he said, "I'm not afraid if God says, Abraham, Zusha, why weren't you as great as Abraham? Because I'm no Abraham. If God says, why weren't you Moses? I'm no Moses. If God says, why weren't you Maimonides? I'm not Maimonides. I wasn't given the mind, the genius of Maimonides." He says, the one question I fear on the day of judgment is if God says, Zusha, why weren't you Zusha? And that's the only question we have to answer. Are we being the best possible version of ourselves? So animals, plants, and inanimate objects don't have free will. But here's what's most interesting. A lot of times people compliment a person and say, "Oh, he's such an angel," or "She's such an angel." But in Judaism, being an angel is not a compliment. Now, I know it's meant as a compliment, but it's not really a compliment. Why? Because let's say an angel is an angel, right? Well, angels only do good. They only do exactly what God tells them to do. An angel, when God says, "Go do this for me, be my messenger," the angel doesn't say, "I'm too tired today. Find someone else to do it." They always obey. But you know why? Precisely because they don't have free will. Just like the animals have no free will, the angels have no free wills. And so we are the only creatures that are a hybrid. Today, hybrids are very popular, right? Human beings are a hybrid. We have an animal soul and a godly soul. We have an angelic part and a animalistic part. And those two parts of us are at odds with one another. That's why we often feel tension and indecisiveness, and we're trying to, being pulled in multiple directions. And when we choose to follow the instincts, the dictates, the guidelines, the instructions, the path of the godly soul, then we're doing a mitzvah. And when we follow our animalistic, instinctual desires and behaviors, even when our brain knows that it's not the right thing, that's when we become animalistic. And it's like a wrestling match. Sometimes this one is on top, sometimes that one's on top, unfortunately. And the tzaddik is the person who permanently defeats his evil inclination, but it's only through their work and hard toil and effort that they could achieve that. And so therefore, when you say a person, "Oh, he's an angel," well, if he's a human being acting like an angel, well, I guess that's a compliment. But angels really don't get much credit because they don't have any other options. They don't have any choices. They live in a spiritual realm where they see God and experience God, and they have no temptation and no other diversions. And so, of course, they could only do what God tells them to do. And that's why, just a little fact of Jewish faith, we Jews never pray Shalom Aleichem on Friday night, Shalom Aleichem, and we say Baruch Hu, Nila Shalom, bless us, angels. We don't want the angels to bless us, because the angels have no free will to determine or decide who to bless and who not to bless. They could only follow God's instructions. And therefore, we're asking God to send his angels and instruct them to bless us as his emissaries. So the opening verse, going back to this week's Torah portion, as my mom, one of the 13 principles of faith is that human beings have free will. And only because they have free will are they accountable for their choices, their behaviors. And when we do good, we're rewarded. When we do bad, we are held accountable, and there are consequences or punishments. And that's because we are granted free will. Now, how this free will works is not so simple. It's a subject of a very, very deep philosophical and theological, thoughts and questions. And there's a lot to be said about free will. But the simple question that everyone asks is, well, how can you say people have free will? We know that people are different nations or different proclivities, or even now, we're not talking about, God forbid, if a person has mental illness, or that's beyond the realm of free will. There are some people, unfortunately, who are not well and they're not held accountable for their actions. But even within the realm of healthy people, there are people who have different struggles, let's say, or weaknesses or tendencies in their character that is very difficult for them. So, for example, there are some people that are always calm, always collected, always mild-mannered. Nothing gets them really excited. They never lose their cool. It's just their temperament, right? Then there are other people who are very hot-headed. The smallest thing sets them off, sparks their fuse, and they have a short circuit, a short fuse. Well, we know there's a prohibition against getting angry. Losing your temper is a sin. Now, clearly, these two people don't have the same level of free will. The person whose temperament is calm doesn't have to put a lot of effort in staying calm. It comes pretty naturally to him. The other person has to really restrain themselves and work at it, right? And there could be so many different areas of life that different people have different weaknesses and lusts or desires that plague them that don't plague other people. So when we say free will, it doesn't mean that everyone has the equal amount of free will in every realm, any area of life. God has his way of judging, and different people with different levels of free will get rewarded or held accountable based on their level of free will. And it also obviously has to do with your upbringing, your education, your background, the role models you had in your life. And only God knows how to calculate. And that's why we are never to judge other people, because we don't know another person's hardships, struggles, past, and therefore we don't know what goes into them making this choice. And sometimes a person who you may think is on a lower level could be considered on a much higher level, because the amount of effort they have to put in to, based on their life experiences or challenges, to overcome a certain challenge or sin, it could be much greater. So to use a very simple example that everyone can relate to, when you go to school as a child or as an adult, all the teachers want to know is, what grade did you get? And, the best student, as kids are starting school now, the kid who has the highest average at the end of the year is going to be the valedictorian. Height is going to be the salutatorian. And kids who get a certain amount of grades are going to get on the honor roll. And there'll be special trophies and awards, right? But you and I know there's some kids in the class who are just gifted. They're very bright. And for them to get a 99 doesn't take that much effort. They could do it. There may be some other kid in the class who isn't as bright, isn't as intellectually strong. And that child has to put in so much effort just to get a 70 or an 80 or an 85. So you may say, well, the kid who got the 99, he's the valedictorian because he got the 99 average. The other kid got a 78 average. But in God's eyes, the kid who got the 78 may have worked a lot harder and put a lot more effort into getting that 78. So therefore, only God knows how much free will we exercise. But that's the basis of the Torah. It would make no sense for God to give us a book of instructions, which the word Torah means instruction, if we didn't have free will, if we didn't have a choice. And this is a big fallacy that a lot of people make when they say to themselves, well, I'm just not cut out for this, or this command is not something that I can do. It's not in my nature. Our nature is not fixed. It could change, it could evolve, we can grow. And a person should always strive to do everything in the Torah, because if God gave us these commandments, then God knows that it is within our capability, every single person. Now, some may excel more than others, some may become more passionate about a particular mitzvah, but any commandment in the Torah, whether it's a positive commandment, something you should do, or something you should not do, we have the ability to do it. You know the story about the child psychiatrist? One time they were pouring wet cement in front of his house, and the kids came in and started to engrave their initials into the wet cement, and the child psychiatrist came out and started yelling at the kids and ranting and screaming and chasing the kids away. When he came in to the house, his wife said, "I was shocked the way you were talking to those children. You're a child psychiatrist. You know better how to speak to children properly, in a loving way, in a sensitive way, so they'll listen, and so on and so forth. You always preach about this, you write books about this, and then you were yelling at these kids like a madman." And the husband says to his wife, "Well, I practice child psychology in the abstract, but not in the concrete." And the idea is that a lot of times we learn different ideas and we say, "Oh, that's a nice abstract idea, but can I concretely actually do that? Nah. Keep Shabbos? Nah, that's not for me." Or kosher is too hard. Or not speaking Lashon Hara. You mean I should go through the whole day and not say anything negative about anyone? Nah, it's a nice idea. It's a nice concept, Don't speak gossip about anyone. But come on, let's be real. We live in a world where, whether you're on the news, you're on the social media, wherever you go, there's gossip going on all around us. How am I supposed to not listen to any of that or engage in any of those conversations? What else am I going to talk about when I meet my friends, for a round of golf or dinner? To practice Judaism in the concrete means, no, God told us not to speak gossip. That means we are capable of actually not speaking any gossip at all. The same thing with every commandment in the Torah. So therefore, God says, "See, I've placed before you. Recognize that I've given you two choices in life, a blessing and a curse." The blessing, the second verse says, is if you will obey, heed, observe the commandments of God that I'm commanding you today. And the curse is if you don't obey the commandments and you veer from the path that I am instructing you today, and you make other gods for yourself. Now, other gods doesn't mean only literally. It means when you start worshiping other things, whether it's money, whether it's power, whether it's beauty, whether it's pleasure, that hedonism, or whether it's even worshiping false ideologies, putting your trust in the wrong powers rather than in the one and only true power, which is Hashem. So the opening verses of this week's Torah portion is very, very, very fundamental and very powerful. And basically says, listen, you have two choices in life. Imagine you come to a fork in the road and there's two signs. One sign has an arrow that says blessing this way. The other sign on the other direction says curse. Which direction are you going to choose? Obviously, the one that says blessing. And therefore, God says to us, always remember that listening to the commandments is the blessings in life, will lead to a life of blessings. The opposite will lead to curse. Now, it's a little bit tricky. Why is it a little bit tricky? Because sometimes immediately it looks like the non-obeyance of God's commandment will lead to blessings. Yeah, if I cheat in business, I'll make more money. I'll have a nicer lifestyle. Or if I'm dishonest, I'll get away with something, if I lie. But the Torah is saying is that don't think long term. And that's why the Torah says, Re'eh, see. You see, one of the differences between hearing and seeing is that your eyesight goes a lot further than your hearing. So if you're talking to me, you have to be, obviously on Zoom, you could be miles away. It's not a problem. But if you were physically next to me, you could hear 10 feet away, 20 feet away. Comes a point, obviously I could raise my voice. But when I step outside, my eye can see a mile away, 2 miles away. I could look at the mountains. If I'm standing out, I look up at a mountaintop. It could be very, very distant, future, far off. In other words, the ability to see is a lot further than hearing. And that's why the Torah says, see, I've placed before you a blessing and a curse. Because right in front of your nose, it may look like, oh, not listening to God will give me a blessing. Or listening to God, if I don't work on Shabbat, I'm going to lose income. My competition is going to get ahead of me. I won't be able to live comfortably. So it may look like it'll lead to a curse. But the Torah says in order to determine what's really the blessing in life and what's really the curse, you have to think long term. You have to have, as they say, seeing. Seeing means you have to have vision. Okay. 20/20 vision doesn't just mean you could see physically well. It means you could see with your 20/20 vision means you could have long-term perspective. And when you look at life in the long term and you say what's really important, you'll always conclude that's the way of the Torah that's going to lead to a life of blessing. And I'll give you the best proof. Here's a fact, okay? All human beings, you go to a funeral, I don't care if it's Jewish or non-Jewish. And when people get up to eulogize the person, what do they talk about? Nobody talks about, his wardrobe or his style. Yeah, they may mention that as just to paint the picture. But what people really talk about is the person's goodness, their kindness, their love, their generosity, their spirituality, their depth, their sacrifices, their devotion, their care, their love of family, their generosity, their service to others. In other words, when we have to look at life with real clarity, we say what's really important. No one's going to get up and say, "Oh, you should see the dinners he ate." You ever go to a funeral and someone talks about, "Oh, you should see the hamburgers he ate," or you should see the house he lived in, the bedrooms. Oh my gosh, you should see the swimming pool he had. Nobody cares about the swimming pool. Yeah, when we're alive, we put a lot of attention on materialistic things, but nobody gets up at a funeral and talks about you should see the cars he drove. Wow, no. Talk about his love to his spouse, to his children, to how he took care of his parents, how he took care of his siblings, how he cared about other human beings, what he did for the community, right? Because we know that that's ultimately the blessings of life. And that's what really matters. And that's what's good, not only in this world, but in the next world, because obviously you can't take with you your material things. The only thing you take with you is your good name, your reputation, your good deeds. What lives on after you is the goodness you do, the lives you've touched, the people you've inspired. As someone said, aspire to inspire before you expire. Aspire to inspire before you expire. That's what life's all about. Being an inspiration, being an example for others. I was with somebody a few weeks ago and they told me a lovely story. They said that in his workplace, he's a religious guy. He's very careful about being religious. And one of the things a religious person is careful about is not speaking gossip. And they were once sitting at a company meeting, some kind of board meeting. They started talking about some other guy and he was quiet. And then someone said, "David, what do you think about this guy?" And then another coworker said, "Why are you asking David? He's not going to say anything bad about anyone." And it made him realize that, he didn't walk around preaching to anybody, don't speak gossip, don't speak negative. But he had influenced people, he had inspired people, because this other person said, "Well, don't even bother asking David. He's not going to say anything bad about anyone else." And people learn from your actions and your behaviors. And therefore, every person has to choose the right path, because it's for yourself and for those who you're setting an example for. So that's why the Torah begins with the word Re'eh, see. Even though the very next verse says, and what is the blessing? The blessing is if you listen to God's commandments. The curse is if you don't listen to God's commandments. So that's the name of the Torah portion, Re'eh, and the idea of a blessing and a curse. But I want to just there's so much commentary on this opening verse, as you could imagine, but just to share some very nice ideas. And one of them is that the verse says, if you read the verse literally, it says, "See, I place before you today a blessing and a curse." Now, it should have said a blessing or a curse, because it's a choice. You could either get the blessing or the curse. Why does it say a blessing and a curse? And one of the beautiful insights is that in life, every blessing can be turned into a curse, or at least many blessings can be turned into curse. And many curses can be turned into a blessing. So I'm sure you all know people who received a great blessing, right? So I don't know. First example comes to mind. Somebody meets a wonderful husband or wife, spouse, and they get married. It's a great blessing. You have a beautiful blessing, right? But then they're not faithful and their marriage falls apart. So you were given a blessing, but just because you were giving a blessing by God doesn't mean it's going to remain a blessing. That's your choice if it's going to be a blessing or you're going to turn the blessing into a curse. Inherently, it was a blessing, but or think of somebody who won the lottery and they're wealthy. But as you know, many people that win the lottery, they often, or I don't know how often, but many times you hear stories of their lives, which were normal lives before they won the lottery, spiral out of control. They get involved in bad things. They start using the money to buy drugs. Their marriages fall apart because they think now that I have all this money, I could go enjoy life and do other things, whatever. Or they end up filing for bankruptcy, losing all their money, right? So God gave you a blessing. You won millions of dollars. You could have used that for many, many good, wonderful things. But as a result, the blessing turned into a curse. And then you have many people, sadly, who they're given a situation in life that may seem like a curse, a challenge, a struggle, a hardship, but they take that curse, so to speak. Nothing's a curse, it's from God, but the point is, and they turn it into a blessing. There was a general in the Israeli army. I just heard this story recently again. His name was Almog. Let me see if I can look it up. But this guy was a very important general in the IDF. And he had a son that was born to him with autism, severe autism. And he describes how he was distraught because he is a powerful, strong general, and suddenly has the son who's not relating to the world around him, and just very, very sad. And he didn't know how to deal with it, looking at his son, which is a reflection of him, and he's all about might and power and so on and so forth. His name is Doron Almog. He did TED Talks about it. It's a very well-known story, Almog. So anyway, so he has this son, and he's struggling dealing with a son who is severely autistic. Anyways, when it came to the Entebbe raid, okay, he was one of the generals that went on this mission, believe it or not. And he flew over to Entebbe to rescue the hostages. And it was very successful raid, although tragically, we all know what happened. Netanyahu died, and a couple of the hostages didn't make it, like 3 out of them, but over 100 were freed in 1976. And he's flying back on the plane with the hostages that are freed, and they're singing. And by the way, I know a member of our shul who's a doctor here in Palm Beach, and Israeli. He was a medical student. He was one of the hostages. So they're singing on the plane, and suddenly he hears the voice of his son within him talking. And his son says to him, Abba, you fly thousands of miles to go free hostages in Entebbe, but your very own son is a hostage in his body living in your own house, and you don't look at him. You don't really give him any attention. How come you go so far to save others, but you don't save your own son? And he said everyone on the plane was singing, and he was started to cry. He knew that voice of his son was correct. His son's name is Iran, E-R-A-N. When he came back to Israel, he decided he would devote his life to freeing the most important hostage, which is his child in his own body. And he went on to do amazing things. Not only did he build a school, he built a whole village for children with autism and brought the best therapies and the best professionals and doctors to work with these children, to help thousands and thousands of children and families with autism. A curse, so to speak. But look what a blessing he turned it into. So the Torah doesn't say a blessing or a curse. The Torah says it could be both. The blessing could become a curse, God forbid, or the curse can become a blessing. And that's all a matter of Re'eh, how you view it, how you see it, what your perspective is. You could look at it, two people could look at the same set of circumstances or be given the same set of circumstances. And one can turn that negative circumstance into a blessing. And while the other could do the opposite, take a blessing and turn it into, God forbid, a curse. So we have to be very careful that even when God gives us blessings, we have to be careful to not ruin those blessings, destroy them, to maintain the blessings, to cherish them, to hold them dear. And at the same time, even when we're faced with challenges, we have to ask ourselves, what is the particular challenge? Moving along to there's so much going on in this week's Torah portion. So we're going to jump around a little bit to cover some of the topics in the Torah portion. So one of the verses in this week's Torah portion says, Vasita hayashar hatov hayashar b'nei Hashem. You should do what is good and what is proper in the eyes of God. And our rabbis say, what does this mean for everything in Judaism? So what is this sweeping statement? Do what is good and proper. I mean, God gave us specific instructions: honor your father, mother, love your neighbor as yourself, return the lost. I mean, there's so many commandments that tell us specifically what is good and proper. Why does the Torah say a general statement, do what is good and proper? And here rabbis teach us that there are certain things that are not necessarily a commandment, but it's, as we would say, the right thing to do. You're not obligated, you're not legally bound to do it, but it's the right thing to do, and you should always do the right thing. So I'll give you a very practical example. There's a law in the Talmud called bar metzra, which in Aramaic means the law of your neighbor. What's the law of your neighbor? Torah says if you have a field and you want to put it up for sale, and the person who owns the adjoining adjacent field wants to purchase it, but you have a very good friend, you want to, or do you sell it to your neighbor? So the Talmud neighbor has an adjoining field, and it's easier for him to have two converting together. So legally, it's your field. You could sell it to whoever you want. You have no legal obligation to sell it to this neighbor. But out of this law that says do what is good and proper in the eyes of God, well, the proper thing to do, the right thing to do is sell it to this neighbor. So there are a lot of times in life that you have the right to do whatever you want, so to speak. You're legally entitled. But there's, as the rabbis say, there is, Amy Rose is dealing with this right now. Okay, so now you know what to do, right? The rabbis say that there's the law, and then there's lifnim mishurat hadin, going beyond the letter of the law. You don't only have to do what's the letter of the law. You have to go above and beyond what's in the spirit of the law. And therefore, don't always look at the technical aspects of, well, am I entitled? Are they entitled? Are they legally right? Are they? And a lot of times think about neighbors, right? Sometimes neighbors have disputes about all sorts of things. Hopefully not. But if you live in a condo association, right? A lot of times there's a lot of politics, or whatever it may be. And a lot of times we view it from the perspective of who's right and who's wrong, rather than what's the right thing to do. I'm going to give you it's called Bina the bar mitzvah is the example I gave, to do what is good and proper in the eyes of God. See, man may say you're entitled to do this or that, but what is proper in the eyes of God? And a lot of examples that we could all relate to, but I once heard this amazing story that happened in Jerusalem. There was these neighbors in a building, and one neighbor decided to build out his porch or his room, and the other neighbor said, "You can't do this. You're blocking some of my view." And the other neighbor said, "I'm entitled to do whatever I want. It's my property. I could build out my apartment." And they got into this big fight, these two men, and they stopped talking to each other. And this guy built out his apartment, and the other guy was upset at him for blocking his view, and they became enemies. Not only did they become enemies, they lived in a building, so they each one gossiped with their friends about the other one, and half the building sided with one guy, the other half sided with the other guy, and it was really, really bad situation. And these two guys wouldn't look at each other. Well, one of the gentlemen had a son who was time for them to get married, and he was having a hard time finding a shidduch. Now, in religious communities, there's a matchmaker who works on shidduchs. So one day, the boy called the matchmaker and said, "Why am I having such a hard time? I'm a fine fellow. What's the problem?" And the matchmaker said, "I'll tell you what the problem is. The problem is that your father and your family has a reputation of being very, litigious, very, controversial, not controversial, but very, what's the word for people who are engaged in a lot of conflict? Yeah, you get the point what I'm saying, right? That they're very, they're engaged in disputes and, quarrelsome people, and people don't want to be married into a family that has so much, negativity and animosity, and the reputation in the communities that you're very, contentious. That's the word I was looking for. Very contentious people. So the young man was very distraught to hear this because he wants to get married. So this neighbor who the parents, are fighting with, he knew he couldn't talk to his father. His father wouldn't listen. Tried talking to his father to make peace. Father was, "No way am I making peace. This guy's terrible. Combative. Thank you. Combative." So the neighbor had a daughter. So he sent a message to the daughter, a text or whatever it was, got her number. Somebody said, "Listen, I want to meet you privately. I need to discuss something with you." He said, "I know that you also are trying to get married, and we're both in the same boat. Our parents' combativeness is affecting our chances to get married. Maybe you could talk to your father. I'll talk to my father, and we could convince them." Anyways, they met to talk about strategies, and they stayed in touch with each other. "How's it going? Let's meet again to discuss again how to go about it." Long story short, they started to have feelings for each other. They liked each other, and they were attracted to each other. Next thing you know, they said, "We think we're a good shidduch for each other. Let's get married." So you can imagine when they went to tell their parents that they've been meeting each other secretly and they want to get married, and these two fathers couldn't stand each other. Well, sure enough, they got engaged, and when the engagement party happened, the whole building showed up in the home of one of these, in the bride's home, and all these enemies who hadn't talked to each other, were bad mouthing each other, were angry at each other. Suddenly, this young boy and girl brought the whole community together. And this is the idea that you always have to not only look at the legality of something, but you have to look at the bigger picture. And it's to ask yourself what is good and what is right. Another major section of Deuteronomy is Moshe Rabbeinu reviewing the Torah, and the Torah tells us which animals are kosher, has to have split hooves and chew its cud, which fish are kosher, has to have fins and scales, and which birds are not kosher. And we could, from the inference of which ones are not kosher, we know that if it's not on the duty. And this morning in the daily video, I talked about what does it mean to have split hooves and chew your cud. Split hooves mean that you could distinguish between right and wrong, good and bad, left and right, so to speak. Chewing the cud represents regurgitating, revisiting what you've digested, not just your food, but your ideas, your perspectives, making sure that they're correct. What about fins and scales? Once again, they're not just random arbitrary signs, they represent something. What do they represent? So fins allow you to swim, even upstream, right? As the show Swimming with the Sharks, right? Fins represents ambition, drive, the ability to progress and to achieve and to succeed in life, right? Your fins allow you, propel you forward in life, right? And everyone wants success. Everyone wants to achieve great things in this world. But the Torah says it's not enough to be kosher to have fins. You have to have scales. What is scales? Scales literally is like a coat of armor that surrounds the fish, which means that a person has to have values, principles, integrity that shield them. That even though I'm swimming like a fish and I could go upstream and I have great forward motion to lead me to great heights and success in life, right? But never at the expense of my values, of my beliefs. You know, there's a fellow by the name of Mr. Bernard. Let me remember what his first name is. He's a motivational speaker. Actually, he wrote books. Kiwi Bernard. You can look him up. So he's a motivational coach, speaker. He speaks in the Fortune 500 companies. And one day he got a call from Microsoft. They were having a convention somewhere for their employees, and he had put out a new book at that time, and they asked him if he could come and speak. He said, I'll be delighted to. They gave him the date of the speech, and the date of the speech happens to be on Shabbat, and he's a religious Jew. He said, I'm sorry, but I can't come on Shabbat. He said, what do you mean? He said, well, I'm religious. I don't speak on Shabbat. I don't do speaking engagements on Shabbat. It's my day of rest. Well, the guy who called went to his boss, and the guy says, well, yeah, just offer him twice the salary. Tell me we'll pay him double. Whatever his speaking fee was, he's going to double. He says, okay, calls him back, says, listen, we're willing to pay you double the normal speaking fee to come on Shabbat. He says, goes back to his boy, says, ain't coming on Saturday, no matter what you pay him. And usually the keynote is on the last day. We'll have you speak a day earlier. You know, they rearrange things just to accommodate him, to get him to speak on Friday. Fine, I'll speak on Friday, and then I could go home for Shabbat. The CEO, or whoever was whoever arranged this convention, calls Kiwi Bernard a week or so later. He said, I got to tell you something. He says, I was on the private plane with Bill Gates coming back from the convention, because he also showed up at the convention. I was told about the convention. I told him the story, how we wanted this religious speaker, this religious Jew, to speak on Saturday. He said he can't. We offered him double. He said, I'm sorry, I can't. We had to arrange the whole calendar to accommodate him. And he said, I want to tell you what Bill Gates said to me. He said, Bill Gates said to me that obviously Bill Gates is worth, I don't know, $50 billion. He says, I'm a person who could buy whatever I want for a price. I can get whatever I want. If I offer enough money, I've always been able to get whatever I want. Whatever someone's price is, if I just offer a little more, I can get them to do what I want. He says, this is the first time that I've encountered something that money can't buy, that was priceless, that you and I, and so I just have to repeat to you those comments he made. And the idea of the fish having fins and scales is, yes, by all means, go forth, as God told Adam and Eve. You know, conquer the world and subdue it, harness all of its latent gifts that God implanted in the world, explore, achieve, create, invent. That's what God wants us to do. He wants us to be his partners in the world, but never at the expense of who you are. Never sell your soul for whatever advancement you're looking to get. Always remember to have your coat of armor. Remember to have your scales to protect you from negative influences. And that's so fundamental for every human being, but especially for a Jew, because many times for a Jew, there could be a temptation to give up some of their religious principles or practices in order to assimilate, to achieve greater success. And therefore the Torah says it's not enough to have fins, you also have to have your scales. Unlike the animal that has identification marks, split hooves and chew its cud, or the fish that has fins and scales, the birds, the Torah only says 19 birds that are not kosher, and all the other ones are kosher. And one of the birds that's not kosher is called a hara'ah. It's actually, if you happen to be in an English, in a Chumash, it's chapter 14, verse 14. So it's easy to remember, 14. No, actually, no, it's verse 13. Chapter 14, verse 13. So it says, Vet hara'ah. The ra'ah is not kosher. Now, what exactly is the ra'ah? What kind of bird is this? So, the ra'ah doesn't translate. It just says the ra'ah bird. You have to look up. We have to look up in Rabbi Kaplan. He translates all. There's different. Some of these birds are ancient birds, so it's not clear. There's different opinions exactly how to translate them. That's why when we're in Israel now, we went to a special museum that's based on animals, kosher animals, non-kosher animals. There's a lot of writings and exploration on all of this. But let me just look it up. Anyways, but the interesting thing is we said the name of the Parsha is Re'eh, see. And we talk about how you have to have vision, you have to have foresight, you have to have insight, you have to have perspective, the right perspective, and that determines if something's a blessing or a curse, how you view it. But yet a non-kosher bird is called the Ra'ah. If it's the seeing bird, why is it called the Ra'ah? So it is the kite. Okay, the kite, which is the non-kosher bird, K-I-T-E. So if it's a seeing bird, why is it not kosher? And the rabbis give us, Rashi quotes a very interesting answer. He says, it sees very well. What does it see? Talmud says this bird could be flying in Babylon and see a carcass in the land of Israel. That's how far it can see. But what the Talmud is telling us is that what does it spot? A carcass, because it wants to prey on a dead carcass. In other words, it's not a question of how good your sight is. It's whether you see the good things or the bad things. You see, there are a lot of people who pride themselves on being very perceptive. Very perceptive. I could see, you ever hear people say, I could see right through people, right? I see their bluff, and they think they're very smart. They could see everyone's negative traits and their underlying subconscious, drives. But that's not what it means to have good sight. Good sight means to be able to see a person's goodness. So the Rabbi once said that Sigmund Freud dug deep beneath the consciousness of a human being, and he found the id, that negative impulse, desire that drives man, sexual desire, whatever it may be. The Rebbe said he didn't dig deep enough. Had he dug deeper beneath the id, he would have found the yid, the Jew, right? How dig do you deep? Do you just dig to see someone's negative, or do you see their innate goodness, their godly soul, their purity, inner holiness, sanctity? So seeing doesn't make you a kosher bird. Kosher bird has to see the good, not this is a bird, it's a bird of prey. All these birds are birds of prey. That's why we don't eat. By the way, one of the things about the Jewish people, which is amazing, is I'd love to get your feedback on this. One of the miracles of Jewish existence, just the fact that we're here is obviously God's hand in history, that we're here as a nation, tiny fraction, been hated by every nation. They've tried to annihilate us in every generation. Tragically, in our generation, the Holocaust, the worst of all. But another amazing thing about Jews are that, look, no one's perfect. Not all Jews are perfect, but on a whole, most people would agree that Jews are a kind, benevolent, peace-loving, generous type of a people. All you have to do is look around. You see all the Jewish philanthropists and causes that Jews support, which is in a very high number in proportion to our numbers. And generally speaking, generally Jews are not violent, aggressive people. We don't have a reputation, unfortunately. When you hear about Jews going to prison, it's usually for, financial things, but violence, aggression, and, being sadistic or it's just not in our nature. On the contrary, Jews by nature are compassionate, are merciful, are generous, charitable, humanitarians, philanthropists. The state of Israel is known for its humanitarian efforts all over the world. And why this is so remarkable is because any psychologist will tell you a child that grows up in an abusive home, that their parents or others abuse them, will become an abuser because they'll have so much anger in them, so much hatred in them. And what we experience, we usually perpetuate on others. And so the Jews were the victims. 6 million Jews were gassed and murdered, men, women, children, our brothers, our sisters, our parents, all right? We should be the most violent, aggressive, angry, vengeful, hateful, mean-spirited type of a people.
I think the rabbi lost connectivity. Let me find out what's going on.
I'm sorry, my phone burnt out, but I'm glad many of you stayed on. I'll just finish the thought. I don't have video, but I have audio. But what I was saying was that how do you explain the fact that the Jewish people are not this violent, mean, and sadistic nation after all the hatred and abuse we've experienced? And there are many reasons. Obviously, the Torah has a lot to do with this, that shaped us and our culture and who we are. But it's also the laws of kosher, because if you look at all the animals that are not kosher, the birds that are not kosher, they're all non-domesticated animals. The animals that are kosher are the animals that are non, they're not carnivorous, right? They don't prey on other animals. And we believe very much that we are what we eat. Becomes your flesh and blood. But we all know when you eat the right foods, you feel good, not just physically, but you feel good emotionally. When you eat the wrong foods, you may have enjoyed the food, but it usually puts you in a bad mood afterwards. So we're very much affected by the food that we eat, and eating kosher food has a positive impact on us. So the idea of not eating the seeing bird that sees negative is one very important lesson. Another important lesson is that there's another bird called the chasidah, which is the stork. Okay, why is a stork not kosher? And it's not like there's a reason. The Torah just says don't eat these birds. Now they are birds of prey, but this bird is called the chasidah, the kind bird. Why is it called the kind bird? Because it's kind. As Rashi says, it does kindness with its species. So if it's kind, why would it be unkosher? And the answer is, as the rabbis say, it only does kindness with its own kind. Kindness to your own kind is not true kindness. If you're only kind to your friends or your family, you're not a kind person. Kindness means you're kind to whoever you encounter, whoever needs your kindness, you're kind to. And therefore, not eating the chasidah reminds us to not be like the kind bird who is only kind to its own kind, so to speak. It's funny how the word kind and your own kind, but to be kind to everyone, and that's what makes you kosher. So I guess we're finishing on the note of kosher. I always like to encourage people to keep kosher. And like everything else, I'll just tell you with this last thought. I was with a friend of mine, actually, when I was in Toronto for a wedding the other week. I met up with a friend, and he's trying to lose some weight. And he met with this trainer and nutritionist and whatever, and they start telling him, he's a rabbi. You got to cut out this. You got to cut out that. He gives him 20 things, that he has to stop eating immediately. And he said, he thought to himself, like he said to this trainer, like, maybe we should go slow. Like, instead of telling me one day I got to drop all these different 20 things, maybe I should ease into it. And it made him realize as a rabbi that you can't just come to a Jew. Yeah, there are people who can go cold turkey. One day, boom, they start eating healthy. They stop eating everything that they shouldn't be eating. But most people are going to get, I'm going to start cutting out soda. Then in a week from now, I'll cut out, cookies, and then bit by bit, I'll get there. So just like with the physical diet, you don't just one day become a healthy eater. You do it gradually, for most people at least. If you could go to your fridge and throw out all the unhealthy food and start eating healthy right now, that's great. But most people do it gradually. Same thing with kosher. If you could start eating kosher today, no more non-kosher. I'm only going to go to the store and buy kosher food with kosher certification. That's wonderful. But doesn't mean you shouldn't start taking baby steps. And whatever those baby steps are, you can look into your refrigerator and say, okay, what could I eliminate from my diet that's not kosher? And it could be simple things, no matter what. We talked about free choice. Whatever level you're at, make the right choices on your level and start moving in the right direction. So again, everyone's on a different level. If you're mixing milk and meat, maybe you start by not mixing milk and meat. Or if you're eating non-kosher meat, maybe I'll get kosher meat. Or if I'm, whatever it may be, always you could take the next step in eating kosher, which is good for your soul, but also good for your body and good for the Jewish people. So when you go to Publix and you see all these kosher items, right? Today, there's thousands of products that have an OU or an OK or a chafke, hundreds of different kosher supervisions. Why do you think those kosher symbols are on the package? It's for you, for the Jewish people. That's what they're there for. It's not for the non-Jew. He doesn't have to eat kosher. It's made for you exclusively. So be proud that kosher, which is in this week's Torah portion, is on the shelf of your local supermarket. And there's thousands of products that someone took the time to go to the manufacturing plant and review all the ingredients and oversee and supervise the manufacturing and make sure it's kosher. So that when you come to Publix, and 99% of the time, whatever product you want to buy, there's a kosher version. So whether it's a spice or a pasta or meat or fish, whatever you want to buy, ketchup, it doesn't matter. Obviously, fruits and vegetables don't need a supervision. Fresh fish, if it has skins and scales, is fine. But it takes a minute to learn what's the kosher brand. And there could be two brands sitting on a shelf side by side. They cost the same, they taste the same. One is made by this company, but one of those companies took the time and the effort and the expense of hiring a rabbi to supervise it. By you simply reaching for the one with the kosher supervision, you are promoting kosher not only for yourself, which is so important, but also for the Jewish people. And you are rewarding that company that spent time and effort to make that available for the kosher consumer. even if it's not that important to you, you're sending a message back to the company saying, yes, I will support you and buy you a product because you took the time to respect the laws of kosher in this week's Torah portion. So it's an amazing opportunity we have every time we go to the supermarket, and by buying a kosher product, you get a tremendous, tremendous mitzvah. And you, more than any other mitzvah, eating kosher, like I said, it becomes your flesh and blood. It becomes you are what you eat. So it makes you a physically and spiritually healthier person. So I wish everyone a great day. Sorry for dropping off, but I'm glad most of you stayed on until I got back a minute later or 2 minutes later, and wish everyone a wonderful day. Take care. Bye.